Let's go ahead and get started. I'm Andrew Foster in the Department of Economics here at Brown. And I have the privilege of hosting two fantastic economists who are here going to grace us with their knowledge today. This is programming as part of the Center for Contemporary South Asia. We have a lot going on. I happen to notice that next week Madhur Jaffrey is in town, and as someone who's used her cookbook for years, I'm looking forward to meeting her, and I hope many of you come back. But today we're talking about economics, not food, and so this is the Jindal Distinguished Lecture Series. I was endowed by Sajan and Sangeeta Jindal to promote a serious discussion of politics, economics, social and cultural change in modern India. Obviously, what we have today fits right into that. So Raghuram Rajan, who gave the first of these two lectures on Wednesday, sort of filled us in on, I guess, a fairly dismal talk about how things are not going so well across India. Today he's going to talk about the vision thing and where do we go from here. So it's hopefully a little bit more upbeat than the last one, but we will see. Raghuram Rajan is the Miller Distinguished Professor from the Finance Chicago Booth. He was the 23rd Governor of the Reserve Bank of India between 2013 and 16. So obviously his talk today is going to build in part on that experience. I was Chief Economist, Director of the International Monetary Fund, so sort of I think that comes to bear. He's the author of a recent book that some of you may have seen, The Third Pillar, How the State and Markets are Leaving Communities Behind. So there's a lot going on. I could go on for minutes and minutes, or if not hours, about all the things that he has done, but I want to leave him the chance to talk, so let me just introduce him now and get started.
Thank you. So if you see me a little stooped, it's because I did my back a disservice playing tennis. So I need to, I will straighten out as I talk. Eventually it gets better. So thank you very much for coming here. Thank you for having me. And let me start by just recapping what we talked about the last time, because that's where I'll take off. Essentially, India has slowed considerably. Certainly from the go-go years before the financial crisis, but even from the 9% growth we had in the first quarter of 2016. Investment, as I pointed out last time, has been slowing for a long time, but most recently consumption growth has also slowed, and consumption was holding up growth in the economy. Now, where do you trace this back to? Clearly, we have legacy problems which haven't been solved. The financial sector hasn't been fully cleaned up. Power sector stress, power plants brought on into operation, but without the feedstock or without purchase agreements, that stress has also not been fully resolved. But the real problem is that we haven't also generated strong sources of growth, new sources of growth, in part because we haven't focused on improving the quality of and access to factor markets such as land, labor, logistics, power, and to some extent finance. The point here is that we had this debate the other day about whether it was the twin balance sheet problem that was the entire problem. And my argument is, yes, that's a manifestation of the problem, the fact that the financial sector is in stress. But the reason it is in stress is because we haven't generated sufficient growth more broadly. And we haven't done the reforms that would alleviate some of these stresses. And therefore, you should see it as a symptom rather than the sole cause, that it is contributing to stress, but it's not everything. And so what all this lack of reform, especially since 2004, since the end of the last NDA regime, is doing is holding back investment, reducing job growth, and reducing income growth. Thereby, if you're trying to hold up consumption, it pushes households into increasing borrowing and sometimes into reducing consumption, as we've seen most recently. Now, in this process, we've had, tipping factors like the ill-conceived demonetization and the poorly executed GST rollout. These have contributed to a slowdown, and you can see it in the data that it's been further hit by these factors. Now, the real problem in India is, even while growth itself is slowing, the government has been fairly successful, as we talked last time, in expanding its welfare programs. The new welfareism, as Arvind called it, has been fairly successful, which in a sense gives it a lot of political capital amongst people. But you can't keep spending without generating revenues, and revenues are generated by growth. So something will have to give. We already see a very stressed fiscal. That's what I talked about. But in this environment of low growth, there's tremendous pressure on the government to increase spending in order to give a fiscal stimulus, and there's very limited space to increase that spending. And eventually, something has to give. Either your spending on welfare has to give, or you'd better generate stronger growth. So what I want to talk about today is really the political economy of what's happening in India, and hopefully a political economy alternative. So the first question I want to ask is, with all the hopes that were imbued in the first Modi government, why are we here? I mean, this was about growth, about jobs, also about bringing corruption down. But why haven't we had stronger economic performance? And I want to argue that part of what's going on is really this government is extremely centralized, which puts a lot of pressure on the leadership. And the leadership, to my mind, I will argue, doesn't have a consistent, articulated vision on how to achieve economic growth. And I think both those words are important, consistent and articulated, because if you have everything in the leadership, everybody below has to know what the leadership wants in order to deliver that. But if it's not consistent and articulated, everybody's left guessing. What is the opinion going to be on this? What is the opinion going to be on that? And you don't get the sustained progress. I want to also talk about these other things. We'll come to that as we go along. Let us start first with why did they not do better? Why did they not do better? And to some extent, I think we've misunderstood what Modi 1 was about. The slogan was minimum government, maximum governance. A lot of people read that and thought, oh, we finally are going to strip away the power of government in India. We're going to liberalize. We're going to free the markets, free the private sector to do more. That wasn't what was meant by minimum government, maximum governance. What was meant is government will become more efficient. Government will do things in a more efficient way, but it'll do more, not less. And that's where a central misunderstanding comes in. This was about enhancing government efficiency rather than liberalizing and reducing the role of government. Indeed, what has instead happened is much more centralization of power, not even in the central government, but within the central government in the Prime Minister's office. And that contrasts with significant decentralization in UPA 1 and UPA 2. In UPA 1 and UPA 2, the Prime Minister's office was much less of a focus of decision making. It was more pushed out to the ministries. Neither that kind of extreme decentralization nor the extreme centralization seems to be particularly effective in India. What you need is something in the middle. Perhaps the Vajpayee government had that middle ground where the ministers had some power, but also the Prime Minister's office had some power. So today what we have is a PMO which essentially works through the bureaucracy. The ministerial level often, not always, but often is bypassed. And ministers are disempowered for the most part. And unfortunately, the bureaucrats, are, this is a caricature, and obviously there are many exceptions, but are typically unwilling to take decisions on their own, and typically don't have strong ideas for serious reform. More of the same, a little better, is probably what they often want to do. But the bureaucracy's effectiveness has been diminished even further by the fact that in parallel, India has been running a campaign against corruption, against the bad deeds of the past, which means many vigilance actions against past bureaucrats. For a bureaucrat today, then there is no significant upside to taking important actions if, in fact, you can be subject to a vigilance inquiry by the next administration, unless you think this administration is going to last forever. And this is particularly brought to the forefront, as I talked about last time, when you single out particular bureaucrats from the last administration for action, not because the actions are problematic, but because they get caught up in the political crossfire. So in this environment, everyone's looking up for orders. But the Prime Minister's office has basically limited capacity, even if they're perhaps the most hardworking sort of lot in government, working 24/7, there's only limited capacity. And so what happens is, as the Prime Minister's office sort of changes attention, something that was on the front burner goes onto the back burner until, again, it gets brought to the forefront. Now, this would be okay, this kind of, if maybe you gave more guidance about where we were going to the bureaucracy. And I would argue there is a lot of uncertainty about the overall economic vision at the top, people's view of what that vision is. Maybe there is a vision up there which is quite coherent, but we don't know about. And there's mixed follow-through below. And this is compounded by the limited coherence in actions. And this contrasts with a very, very strong and very clear political vision. So you have a strong political vision which is delivering all that it said it would, and you have an economic vision which is a series of programs. They don't amount to an entire economic vision. What is the underlying economic vision, especially when you get to the production side and move away from the welfare side? So are you more for markets, or are you more for the state? Are you more protectionist? Are you more open? Are you more liberalizing? Are you more populist? You can find examples of each of these. Now, every government has examples of each of these, but there's no articulation. Where are we going to put more weight? This or that? So if you want to make, for example, India more open and do more production in India, well, economists would say, well, that means you have to bring down tariffs, because much of production for the globe is importing a lot, adding your value, and then exporting it. That means a low tariff regime. So, but on the one hand, we say we want to make for the world. On the other hand, we have a lot of uncertainty about tariffs, with them raised and lowered. We used to be lowering them steadily. Now we've been raising them recently. Now, again, the lack of a consistent vision would be okay if lowered down. The sort of if it wasn't, everything was not so centralized. You have different sort of ministries doing work, that could be okay. You can't have centralization and not have that clear vision up there of where you want to take the economy. And what instead we have then is everybody's looking on top. There are no ideas systematically being generated below, which means the top has to come out with bold ideas every so often. But because those ideas haven't been tested broadly, they come out of the blue and sometimes can be seriously problematic. Demonetization was perhaps a classic version of that, which also means that even when there are these strong ideas put out, let's kill India, let's clean India, the Swachh Bharat program, the follow-through is also very, very narrow. So bureaucrats are very good at following orders. Clean India, Swachh Bharat means build toilets. So they build toilets. Now, whether they're used or not, different question. But there are a lot of toilets which are built. Now, to be fair, and this is what I said last time, a fair number are being used. This is moving in the right direction. But it would be better if we had a broader concept of we were going to improve sanitation and this is all that we need to do. And that was the focus of the broader program, rather than numerical target, how many toilets have you built and how many zones are total defecation free, which there has been a lot of debate about. Similarly, I think on the bank accounts opened, that was a program, the Jan Dhan program. Again, strong orders to the public sector banks, open the bank account. But nobody said the bank account had to be used. And so as the bank accounts were opened, down the line, we figured out a fair number of them had zero balances. Nobody was actually using them. So then you build in the infrastructure. Maybe this is the right way to go. Put the bank accounts in place and then figure out over time how they would be used. But perhaps a better way is to think about the broader ecosystem and put that in place. But that requires broader thinking, not necessarily by the top, but by everybody around it. And that doesn't happen because these ideas come out of the blue. And of course, the actions can then work at counter purposes if there is no clear sense of where we're going. So bankers have been told to take commercial decisions. One of the strengths of Modi, the Modi one, was the fight against corruption. And part of the fight against corruption was bankers would no longer be told by the ministry, here's who you have to lend to. The phone calls from the ministry would cease, and all decisions would be taken on a commercial basis. That was a good thing. But at the same time as they told that, there are new programs that are imposed on them, such as the Mudra scheme, which is about lending to MSMEs. And each branch is given a target. You have to make so many loans of this kind and that kind. Well, once you do this, bankers are looking for direction. I can't make this commercially because I have no sort of capability to make this level of loan every time in my area. And so almost surely this kind of thing becomes politicized quickly. If you can't make it on commercial decisions, what criteria do you use to make these decisions? For a while, there was a distinction that the government tried to make on this kind of lending. These kinds of programmatic lending was called intervention. And the government reserved the right to intervene, but said it would not interfere. Interfere was making a phone call saying, give it to my friend. So that was beyond the pale, but intervention was okay. The problem is intervention, when it is based on non-commercial principles, what will it be based on? If it's not based on commercial principles, then it becomes based on, political principles. And where do they come from? It creates a vacuum in which, it's not lending to my friend, but lending to the constituency that I like, or lending to the political affiliations that I like. That becomes problematic. Those loans, the loans to the small and medium sector, are now in trouble, which is why the RBI is now exercising forbearance over them. And the problem with exercising forbearance is it doesn't reduce the number of bad loans, almost always increases it. And not only is this a problem, but now we're going towards even less commercial principles. We're going back to the era of loan mailers. Make loans, just call everybody in and make a lot of loans. I think the banks are still trying to take decisions based on commercial principles. Let's hope they can succeed. Similarly, in this place where there's a lot of centralization, but you're trying to work through the bureaucracy, you need bureaucrats to take clear decisions. As I said, one of the problems is that at the same time as you're telling them to take decisions, you're also going after past bureaucrats who took decisions and asking them why they did that. Particularly problematic is that even senior officials are now being probed, sometimes without upfront evidence that anything seriously bad happened. I do worry that a current former finance minister has been held in jail without trial for now over a month. And I'm not saying I know anything about the whether there is some activity that requires at some point he will be indicted on that. But what is clear is thus far there has been no actual trial, and he has been held in prison for a long time without that. And the reasons for holding him keep changing, which suggests that there is no clear reason why this is happening. This is worrisome. Let me leave the issue of civil liberties and so on aside, but from the very point that you're trying to run a government in which you want people to take clean decisions, but the protection for decisions that until it is shown to be something which was outside the law, you have the protection of not going to jail. Even for a former finance minister, that is being violated. So this is a very worrisome development. Similarly, we want to attract foreign direct investment, but we keep moving tariffs up and down, not a good regime in which to attract foreign direct investment. So this leads to the question, can India be run from the top? And I would argue it's easier to run a state from the top. But when you run a country from the top, it becomes much harder because you've got to create an overall framework for operations and then decentralize the decision making so that not just your ministries, but further down to the states so that people can actually do what they need to do. For India to be run from the top, it's become too big an economy to do that. And unfortunately, the experience so far is it simply doesn't work. So let me then go to the next question. So do people really care? After all, Modi too came back with an enormous majority. Is that a sign that India's public doesn't care about economic performance? And I want to go back to, let us not dismiss some of the good things the Modi government did. It wasn't about growth, but it was about public distribution. And that some of those things worked really well. I think what the public experienced was good enough for it to re-elect the Modi administration. But what the Modi administration did in economic performance is not sustainable. And therefore, unless it changes, we're going to have problems down the line. So that's the point I'm going to make. So, I think Ashu is doing some serious work on voting behavior. So think of what I'm going to say as conjectures as to why the Modi's two came in with such a large majority. Well, clearly, Prime Minister Modi stood out with a relatively clean public reputation, despite allegations such as the Rafale deal and allegations of closeness to certain business houses. His reputation, I think, publicly, and Ashu's work may tell on this, was of a clean administration. The allegations simply did not stick. Second, in the nature of most populist governments, there was a strong attack on the elite and a sense that the government was with the ordinary people, and this helped sell unorthodox policies like demonetization widely. So again, evidence that Abhijit has done through surveys suggests a lot of people, even though they were personally harmed by demonetization, thought it very good because it was also an attack on the elite which did not pay taxes. Furthermore, and this is the point I showed with the graphs last time, consumption growth supported by borrowing and transfers, as well as the household-friendly measures like the cooking gas, free cooking gas, really gave people a sense they were better off. Despite the fact that unlike NDA 1, there were few deep reforms that liberalized growth and markets, in terms of distribution, this was a step forward, including the direct benefit transfers and so on. So there was some benefit, at least on one side, and that worked very well. And of course, the administration had a superb command over social media, which helped sell the government's performance widely, even while adverse developments were buried. So, even today, you see that WhatsApp messages going around saying 5% growth, this is wonderful. We're growing wonderfully well, not recognizing that 5% growth is a big come down and effectively is much lower than India needs to employ its many youth. But 5% growth is now the new Hindu rate, which is fine. That's the kind of messaging which works quite well. And of course, we know that in the election itself, at a very critical point in a classic populist nationalist move, we changed the dialogue from a dialogue on economic performance to a dialogue on national security. Which then takes me to the question of, what about national security? Is this kind of administration good for national security in the direction that we're going? And certainly in the second administration, we have emphasized majoritarian issues like triple talaq, like Kashmir. And the budget seemed to indicate that economic revival was something that was not in the forefront, that it was more these other issues. And, you know, I want to put my cards on the table. I don't believe that the majoritarians actually improve national security. They weaken it because they want national integration on their terms. In India, this means universal imposition of Hindutva. And it sells wonderfully well with certain Hindus who believe minorities are privileged. Yet, majoritarianism, like everywhere else, majoritarian nationalism is intrinsically divisive because it labels a bunch of citizens the others. And by setting impossible terms for these minorities to be considered true citizens, it eventually ends up alienating them. And if they're a sizable portion of the population, as Abraham Lincoln said, a house divided cannot stand against itself. And I fear that this track leads nowhere good. So I would ask you, is India going to be more peaceful and strong if it engages with the protected minorities and charts a common consensus for change, or if it imposes a majoritarian wish list on them? My preference certainly would be for the former. And in fact, this was the view of India's freedom fighters, led by Gandhi, whose 150th anniversary we all celebrated recently, who believed that mutual tolerance and respect leading to internal cohesion was the only option for a diverse country like India. It was the way India led the world by saying all of us can come together. It resembled, in a sense, the melting pot that the United States had. And this reflected considerable thought. And my fear is, by moving away from this paradigm, we do not bring national security. So let's put these all together. Economic strength, national cohesion, and national security. Reality is, a lot of Indians feel very proud when they see their leaders being feted across the world, being celebrated by the US president, meeting on equal terms with Xi Jinping and with Putin. But the reality is people respect Indian leaders, not because necessarily of the force of their personality, that may help, but because they represent a 1.3 billion strong market democracy that is growing fast. I want to underline market, democracy, growing fast. All those four words are important for respect. If we weren't growing fast, we would not be so attractive to people. If we were not a democracy, many of our traditional friends would get worried. And if we were not a market economy, I think there would be questions about both growth as well as democracy. So any change in the underlying words will quickly change the reception, India's reception and its friends in the world, and certainly returning to a slow pace of growth will almost surely ensure that, but also give us much less ability to defend ourselves against external threats of domination. So in the long run, it seems to me that internal cohesion and economic growth, rather than divisive populist majoritarianism, will be India's route to national security. So all this sort of majoritarianism may certainly, for a while, win elections, but it is taking India down a dark and uncertain path. So let me go next to let's try and ask, can this be good for India? The majoritarianism which is leading gently to authoritarianism. Can it take us in the right direction? And I would argue that India is better off strengthening its democracy and decentralizing rather than going in the opposite direction. And let me explain, because there is is this where I'm? Yeah.
You've been
No.
on this
No.
slide for some time.
No, this is the third one. Yeah, I'm on this third point. Should we be building? Yeah, this is a different presentation from the numerous slides I presented on. That was empirical. This is theoretical. So far less to more observations. So there is a real question of what kind of political model works in India, right? And if you look at Asian economies, which are probably the closest comparison, many Asian economies were much more autocratic when they started growing. And they typically did catch-up growth. And catch-up growth is quite compatible with centralized direction because there is a path. You know what the path is because others have trodden it. And you know how to walk along that path. Typically involves substantial investment in infrastructure. Construction is a big part of growth during that phase. Involves heavy industry, all that stuff that we are familiar with from the East Asian economies. And usually governments with limited capacity, of which India is one, find it very hard to grow while respecting democracy. If you want to acquire land in a democratic fashion, respecting the democratic rights of the people, it requires significant government capacity. It requires a first world capacity. Try building a highway in this country, you'll have many NIMBY movements. It requires a lot of subtle maneuvering, but a lot of also work by the government. So democracy requires fairly capable governments, especially at the stage of growth where you have to build. And so India has found it hard to build. We've found it hard to build infrastructure because every time we try and put stuff into the ground, there are protest movements about, this is my land, how can you take it away without appropriate compensation? And even when you compensate, there are further debates to be had. So many East Asian economies democratized only after they got to middle income. And as they approached the productivity frontier, that was a nice turning point. A country like Korea or a country like Taiwan. And why did they democratize as they passed middle income? One possibility is more educated masses demanded democracy. Another possibility is that as you get closer to the frontier, you need more innovation. Innovation requires debate and free speech, and that was why they democratized. A third possibility is that as you get closer to the frontier, you need to liberalize, expand markets, and competitive economic markets require competitive politics and vice versa. Happy to elaborate, but there are various theories as to why democracy accompanies wealth and vice versa. Not in every case, but a very strong correlation. And so the question is, what are the forces that drive that? We don't quite know. The fact is there are no rich countries that are not democratic, except for the oil kingdoms. And one could argue a little bit about some of the small sort of open economies like Hong Kong and Singapore. But really, any large country that is rich is typically also democratic. So could we not do the following? Let's become authoritarian. Get to middle income. And then we switch. We become democratic and become, do the Asian path. Why don't we follow the Asian method? And the arguments for this is India is still relatively poor, needs infrastructure. Authoritarian government can build roads and bridges while stifling political protest and land expropriation. It can also suppress domestic interest rates, lower commercial lending rates to favored industries, and intervene in the exchange rate to foster export-led growth. And some element of this is always out there in India as something the government should do. And then once you've done all this, a la China, hopefully a la Taiwan and Korea, you democratize at that point, and you've reached middle income. After all, what do people want? They want a full stomach first. after which they start worrying about freedom. So isn't this the way to go? I mean, this seems like a nice fairy tale, but it is a fairy tale because it's not always this path that you follow when you're authoritarian. You don't necessarily follow the successful East Asian path. There's also the Latin American path you could follow, which is a lot less happy when it has been followed. So let me talk a little bit about that. So, given where India is, I would believe, given the experience of democracy, given the experience of populism, we are more likely to embrace the Latin American model, where there is a lot of popular spending to buy legitimacy for authoritarian governments. So we will spend a lot, and in order to foster this spending, we will probably go from fiscal problem to fiscal problem, as the Latin American economies have gone. We're probably more likely to do that than follow the East Asian model of consumption suppression and investment and export-led growth. And so is that a reasonable model, a viable model? No, it essentially has very low investment, a lot of consumption. It is, for a while, democratic, but it swings. And it swings from crisis to crisis. That's clearly not a model which is going to benefit our growth. And it's also a very poor model when you reach middle income, because you've underinvested in your population, you've underinvested in your human capital, and you're not able to take growth further once you pass middle income and are at the frontier. So I would argue, even though it may seem India's democratic model and its institutions are at this point unsuited for where India is economically, I think it's the best we can do, and we should cherish and nourish these so that in a while, when we reach middle income, we will actually have a better model, a better framework to grow rapidly from there. And this is basically saying that India needs to strengthen its democracy and its institutions rather than giving in to the allure of authoritarianism. Democracy, we sometimes are satisfied that we have good, strong elections. Well, democracy is not just about elections. It's not just about how elections are conducted or how they're reported, but a lot of it is what happens after the election. As Fareed Zakaria, and I'm sure there's a big political science literature about this, democracies can be illiberal democracies. That's a fine term he coined, in which what happens after the election is not particularly democratic. So it's important that we preserve that sense of democracy. And I worry that India is going in the wrong direction at this point, that institutional checks and balances are weak in India. They've always been relatively weak, especially because the private sector is so dependent on the government. It's hard to imagine private sector entities like the New York Times, Bloomberg, or the Washington Post, which conduct investigations of the administration. It's hard to imagine that in India, where the government has the power to essentially take away the private sector's profits, either by sort of changing who it favors, by reducing government advertisements, say, to the press, but also through very targeted investigations, because the problem is that every government in India, because of the weakness of these institutions, every government with a massive majority runs the risk of becoming authoritarian. This was as true of Indira Gandhi after her win in 1971 as it is true of the Modi government in 2019. That this risk is ever present. And the key to whether the government actually succumbs to this temptation is whether it erodes checking institutions or strengthens them. And unfortunately, recent actions don't inspire a lot of confidence. For example, investigative agencies and tax authorities seem to suddenly find great interest in opposition leaders just before the relevant state election. Why most of the potential evaders and problematic politicians are only in the opposition and not in members of the opposition who pledge allegiance to the ruling party is unclear. It certainly seems that it's not entirely unconnected to their political affiliations. The Election Commission in this election, certainly there has been some discussion about whether it was neutral. What is worrisome is one of the commissioners who dissented against some of the rulings of the Election Commission now suddenly finds that his wife is subject to a tax investigation. Even the high judiciary, which was so active in the past on pretty much any issue, has been strangely silent in the constitutional issue of whether the changes in Kashmir are actually warranted or not, and whether the continuing restrictions on a sizable number of citizens there is okay constitutionally. I mean, these are issues where our institutions should be able to come to the fore. Take, for example, as somebody has pointed out, the contrast with the UK Supreme Court, which pronounced quite quickly on the suspension of Parliament and on the constitutionality of that. The issue of Kashmir is an issue of states' rights, which is, I can't think of a more important constitutional issue. And it's something that, the Supreme Court should pronounce on sooner rather than later. Of course, with due deliberation, but it is something that should be at the forefront. And in addition to this issue of the liberality of Indian government, in addition to the administrative centralization, we're seeing some constitutional centralization. The constitution in India gave the center substantial powers because the big issue when India was formed was the unity of India. So the center has substantial powers, including the power to declare emergency, but these were necessary in an emerging nation. Over time, we have achieved that unity, and increasingly the issue is how do we manage all the diversity amongst the various regions, including different rates of economic growth, different languages, different beliefs, different ethnicities, and different practices. And decentralization offers a way forward from that rather extreme constitutional centralization that we had earlier, including offering a way to checking the power of the center and making us a more liberal economy. And recently, typically in the past, we've seen a growing decentralization. Every finance commission, for example, tended to give more funds to the states, and within the states, push more funds to the to local government. But recently, we've gone in the opposite direction. We've already talked a little bit about Kashmir. Kashmir was converted from a state into a union territory, which is much less empowered than a state, and converted by the center. We still have to hear about the constitutionality of that particular action. The terms of reference of the 15th Finance Commission, this is the latest one which is going to opine on the share of resources of the center versus the state, are such that they seem to, at least a prima facie, favor the center, including, for example, giving the center the right to decide whether a state merits some of the funds that are devolved to it, based on certain conditionality. This is something that the former RBI Governor, Y.V. Reddy, who led the 14th Finance Commission, has been very strong about, that this is not the center's money to decide whether to give or not. This is a grant of this is a decision by the Finance Commission, and the center can't hold it back. So there is a creeping centralization, including in the center a much greater use of cesses. There's an interesting idea in India that cesses, which are essentially a tax, remain with the center. They don't have to be shared with the state. So increasingly, more and more of the fiscal revenue is determined by cesses. Some of you who pay Indian taxes may see, I pay 30% tax, but then there's a surcharge and a cess and something else, which raises my tax rate considerably. And the reason for that is all that goes to the center doesn't have to be shared with the state. Now there are arguments that the defense budget should be paid out of revenues first, and then the rest will be divided because, after all, the states benefit from defense. So all sorts of arguments now to reverse the devolution of funding to the states, again a worrisome sign of the creeping centralization. Let me then go to my last point, which is going to be a little longer. So what can we do in this, in reviving growth? After all, stress is always an opportunity for change. How can we strengthen that political economy model that of democratic decentralization that India, in my view, would benefit from? And how can we move to that? I think, so here's my wish list. Obviously, you need political power to do this, and it's not clear that the political power is moving in this direction. But my wish list on the political front would be to go back to our trend. We had a trend which we have moved away from, which is greater democratization and greater decentralization. So, for example, the institutions that are critical to democracy, we need to further move to politicize their appointment, the appointment of their leadership, and reduce interference/intervention in their functioning. There's no more important institution than the Supreme Court, but also investigative agencies and bodies like the CAG, the CBI, the CVC, the CIC, lots of C's, you know what I'm talking about, including the vice chancellors of various universities. Universities are an important source of independent ideas. And to politicize their appointment is to reduce the flow of ideas to something which is more politically convenient and can be problematic more longer term. And of course, I've already talked about the need to go back to the path of devolving funding from the center to the state, but also from the state to local bodies. The states also have been remiss in not pushing funding down to the local bodies, and it's important that we not only devolve funding, but we also try and devolve powers based on the principle of subsidiarity. Move powers to the lowest level which is capable of handling them effectively. That's important because we need our municipalities to clean their streets, to build the relevant infrastructure, to do everything that you wish modern cities would do, but often they don't necessarily have either the funding or the power to do what is needed. This also increases the public's ability to hold the government at every level accountable. And the more localized it is, the more we can see what the government is doing and can object. Local police, for example, paid by local funds, will be much more sensitive to local needs than, for example, if the local police is essentially employed by the state and responds to commands from the state capital rather than the locality. Of course, you have to have a more engaged public which monitors all this more effectively. But first, we have to start doing this, and I think a lot of work on Panchayati Raj suggests it has been, on net, a positive. So let me end by saying all this implies that not only do we have to perhaps try these political changes, but we also have to ensure that our economy reflects this kind of broader democratization as we reform it to enhance growth. And I would argue that if we focus on reducing the government's ability to arbitrarily interrupt, facilitate, investigate, or fund economic activity, we will also help the process of democratization and decentralization. So let us make economic changes that help this process. And most immediately, I would say this involves a bunch of things. I'll talk more detail about the items in red. Let me just quickly walk through this. If we were to deal with economic problems today, we would start by dealing with the stress sectors. There's no point offering more stimulus in the economy if the stress sectors hold back any possible economic growth. And by stress sectors, I mean things like real estate, construction, the banking system, the non-bank financial system. These are areas that need immediate attention, the power producers and so on. Second, we need to liberalize the economy so that it can actually generate stronger growth and growth with more productivity, which is improve the functioning of our factor markets, market for land, market for labor, the financial market, even the market for the right laws. We also obviously, in trying to foster this, should prune some areas where we regulate excessively and don't actually enforce the regulations appropriately, move it down to a minimum set of regulations that we actually do enforce. At the same time, there are other areas where we are woefully under-regulated. And typically, anybody who's been to the hill stations and sees the proliferation of the way housing is built will know that whatever zoning laws and whatever laws we have simply don't seem to function there. So we have to find ways to make it much more effective in the purpose, and the environment is something where this is quite important. In order to democratize, we have to reduce the public sector presence. Part of the reason governments in India have so much power is because they control financing. 70% of the banking system is in the hands of the government. There are also a number of state-owned companies. Life Insurance Corporation is under the thumb of the government. When you have so many ways of favoring some and disfavoring others, it is a temptation for any government. And it is the source by which you can affect people's actions. Of course, regulation is also another way. The ability to raise tariffs, lower tariffs, the ability to investigate people with tax investigation. All these are ways you can do it, but we need to reduce the arbitrariness of these ways, and that will make India far more democratic, but also far more amenable to growth. So we have to re-embark on steadily reducing trade barriers and tariffs, keep them relatively low, keep them relatively predictable. That will bring more foreign direct investment. Yesterday I showed foreign direct investment hasn't budged over the last, in fact, since 2007, 2008, it's pretty much at that level at its peak. And this contrasts with other countries at this phase of growth, which attract a tremendous amount of foreign direct investment. And finally, we have to worry about the fisc. There's a sense sometimes in India, the fiscal doesn't matter. Let's just pump more, let's spend more and not worry about the fisc. One of the things India has done well over the last few decades has been run a reasonably tight ship. We have populist pressures, but we've reversed them in times of trouble. One example was in 2012, when Mr. Chidambaram came back to the finance ministry and tried to narrow the budget deficit. And some of that narrowing helped us during the taper tantrum. And certainly the process of fiscal consolidation has helped us in the last few years. We need to be careful about the fiscal and bring it back to the path. Let me spend the last 4 or 5 minutes on specifics in these areas. How do we deal with stressed sectors? One of the big problems in India is the spread in problems in the financial sector. Today, we have non-bank financial companies which are distressed because they have distressed loans to construction companies, real estate, infrastructure. There's a temptation to say these are private sector firms, let's close our eyes. Some of them will go bust. Some of them will survive, not our problem. Let's just provide liquidity and the system will take care of it. Reality is there is a solvency problem in some of these entities. And while there's a solvency problem, it's not clear which entity has a solvency problem and which has not, and what the contagion possibilities are, there will be a constant attempt to guess who it is and what their problems are. This is going to make the sector fragile. There is a need in such stress situations to prevent the problem from spreading for the government to come in through the regulator, look through the balance sheets of these companies, figure out which ones can be saved, which ones cannot, and figure out a way for the ones that cannot to put them in some form of receivership so that they don't serve as an overhang over the market. This is the classic game plan for distressed situations, even if it involves private sector firms, so long as these can be systemic. Given that non-bank finance companies are 17% of the economy, you can't avoid doing this. If you do that, if you keep avoiding it, eventually the problems will spread more widely. Unless the government is completely sure that each one of these stressed companies is isolated from the rest of the system, it's extremely important that you do that search and rescue, by all means, by imposing losses on the private sector shareholders where necessary. If the firm is insolvent, they should be wiped out. But you cannot let what sometimes is called a zombie institution continue operating for fear that the risks that are created by this institution spread through the system. You cannot stay assured saying we've provided liquidity. That's not enough. You have to go in and provide additional supervision. And that sometimes means some of these companies are sitting on vast amounts of, say, unsold apartments. In order to protect the system, it may also mean holding these apartments off the market till prices stabilize, or selling them at a reasonable rate so that you don't upset the market and create yet more turmoil. This is a classic fire sale situation. If all the stressed assets were unloaded on the market, it could collapse prices. And that would make the problem potentially worse. So you want to have a good sense of what fundamentals should be. That's something which is not beyond the capacity of our regulators. And start a process of taking some of the stressed assets off market, but releasing them at a reasonable pace. Now, in all this, the fear that governments have is that some of these decisions are going to be arbitrary. Some of them are going to be the source for future governments to accuse you of shenanigans and investigate the process and send the CBI and the et cetera after you. But this is governance. Governance is about taking hard decisions. You have to make it as transparent as you can, but you cannot avoid hard decisions. And that's something the government has to do. There are other stressed sectors. Agriculture is stressed, power is stressed, banking and non-bank finance companies are stressed. Abhijit and I, along with 11 other economists, have written a whole book on this. And if you want some of our thoughts, go ahead and read that. Let me move to the second issue, the functioning of factor markets. The reform of the labor market and the land markets seem to be an elite project. Or this is something only economists worry about. Well, we worry about it because that's the source of sustainable growth. If you don't have a reform to the labor market, you have what Arvind Panagaria always complained about. He was the former Niti Aayog chairman, that India has very many small firms which are not very productive. We need larger firms which are much more productive. For that, you need to be able to hire. And the problem is, as you grow in size, your ability to fire diminishes. People get more, your employees get more rights. What India needs to do is move from this dual contract, contractual relationship with labor where you hire and fire at any time. They have no rights whatsoever. And permanent labor who have all the rights, you can't fire them. We have both those, nothing in the middle. It does seem that India would better off grandfather the guys who have permanent jobs, but find a way that you move the guys with temporary jobs, contractual jobs, to more security by giving them multi-year contracts and building up their stake in the firm by, for example, increasing severance pay over time. So there are things you can do to improve the labor markets even while adding more flexibility, things that would improve job security, would not ensure everybody a permanent job, but would get people something much better than they have today, which is really contractual uncertainty. Land markets, and then I'll end. Land markets also need to be improved. One of the biggest stumbling blocks in India is acquiring land. Now, we are a democracy. We need to acquire it in a fair way. But there are lots of ideas on acquiring it in a fair way which give the person who sells the land substantial revenues in the future, land sharing agreements, agreements where you develop, you take 5 acres, develop all 5, give back 2 to the farmer or whoever you've taken it from. Many of these work, but we need to find best practices here and not get stuck in an equilibrium where we can't buy the land that the farmer actually wants to sell. But we can't buy it because we can't agree on a price which is reasonable and which is not subject to political intervention later. And we don't build those roads, airports, ports that we desperately need to get growth going, and even the public housing. I've talked a little bit about the public sector presence. I will, on tariffs and trade barriers, I would say what we need is certainly a focus on making India more export competitive, But we can focus not just on manufacturing, but non-traditional exports like education. Improving our education institutions and getting students from the rest of the world would be a way of exporting. Similarly, healthcare. We can provide doctors to the rest of the world. We now export them. Why not export Indian services by getting patients to come into India? That means make their experience much easier. Tourism is, of course, a big service factor. And finally, even for manufacturing exports, we need a more transparent, institutionalized process for changing regulations and tariffs on investors. Today, it's on a whim and can be changed overnight. This was the complaint that Amazon and Walmart had. They thought they were buying into a particular regime and started investing on that basis, and the rules got changed on them overnight. We need a more transparent process for this. So let me end by asking, does this help the process of democratization? Now, I would argue if we follow this process by liberalizing more, going towards a government with more checks and balances, a more market-driven economy, not only will the private sector become more efficient and independent, it will become more of a check on the government as in this country. Now, I'm not saying the private sector in this country is perfect. I'm just saying in industrial countries, there's a power which is independent of the government. That is the private sector, and that's a good thing. Moreover, you will have foreign investors who will flock in, bringing new technologies and capital, and even the need to keep them interested and engaged will also be another check on government policy. So my sense is all this works together, not at odds with each other. And so I basically conclude by saying that, well, this is what I just said, economic adversity is a terrible thing to waste. It offers the scope for substantial reforms if there is a will. Now, the current government has a tremendous majority, and on its own, it can decentralize more while strengthening institutions. There is no outside pressure to do that, but it would be a good thing in my view. Where there is pressure is to revitalize growth. And if it does this relying on market forces, which seems to me the best way to do it, this will help further democratize India. Alternatively, it can stay on the current course, and it may be that the political success may divert attention from the growing economic stress. However, this is something which may eventually prove unsustainable because without stronger growth, the distributive policies, which are so important to this government, will overwhelm revenues, driving the economy into a hard corner. So time will tell what the government chooses. I hope it chooses the right thing. Thank you.
All right, thank you for those words. So our commentator is Abhijit Banerjee. He's the Ford Foundation Professor of Economics at MIT. I like to think of him as one of the heroes of my little field of development. He helped us bring us back into the mainstream of economics, and through founding JPAL and part of the BRED and so forth. But obviously, he's of great interest outside of development in the field more broadly.
This one.
Yeah.
No, not yet. Thank you.
There we go. All right, so please, Abhijit.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. These are great lectures. I read the other one, and they're essentially exactly as I expected. They're thoughtful, wise, comprehensive, and I agree with a very large part of what he has to say. So what do I do? I mean, that's sort of, you could say that and shut up, but maybe that's not, one day I want to do that, actually. It seems like you're forced into this corner of having to actually give comments and somehow manage to disagree, and sometimes that's difficult. So, I feel trapped, but I'll try. So what I decided to do is just, remove the judicious part of Raghu. Just go take the same material, but kind of dial it up. Give a kind of a cartoon guide to this material. Maybe once the judicious is taken out, you'll have a more clearer sense of, I think, what the underlying, maybe more dire message that I think I read in in these slides. So that's and maybe at the end I'll say something that will maybe provoke some disagreement from Raghu and from many others, and then we'll have a conversation as well. So I think the starting point is the past, as always, and I think the mystery, I've said this many times, I don't know why India is growing. I know all the reasons why it shouldn't grow. I've written about many of the reasons it shouldn't grow. The stalled liberalization that it stalled a long time ago. It's not now. It's stalled a long time ago. If you look at average tariff rates, they kind of plateaued in 2002 and have not really changed. The broken banking sector, that I think is more recent. It got more and more broken after the 2009 spending boom. The archaic labor laws, the land acquisition that Raghu talked about, the education sector, which I've written about, the healthcare, and more. I mean, so it's very easy to come up with all the reasons India shouldn't grow. But I think the interesting question, and that helps us in the diagnosis of what things might have gone wrong, is to recognize that it was growing and that there is something, it was doing something was going right. This is not, I know that the growth numbers are extremely controversial now. I suspect Arvind was not entirely coy about it. So but here's a number that you should to see as an independent check on. This is poverty. This is, and you can see that basically poverty is flat or slowly falling till 1990 and then completely crashes, goes from something like 40% to something like 15%. And that's an enormous change, and a change that happens, wouldn't have happened without growth, especially since all the other evidence, we know that inequality went up a lot. So if inequality goes up a lot and the economy doesn't grow, you don't have a reduction in poverty. So I think there is very clear, this is independent check in a sense on that. The GDP data, you believe or not, this is I think something that did happen. I'll come back to that. So I think why did it work? Well, I think one thing is that I think just the country of India size, if we look at the world tech sector, you see how many of the top people in the world tech sector are actually people who are educated in the Indian education sector. You just take 1.3 billion people, take the 0.001% of that with a decent education sector for the top, and it's very hard to go wrong with that. So I think there's lots of talent. A very old and very sophisticated business community, long history, at least 2,000 years of international trade. I do think that those things count. There's experience, there is implicit knowledge. I think one of the things that was very critical is just how misallocated the economy was. Now, why do I say that? Well, misallocation, in a sense, is an opportunity for growth. You've accumulated a bunch of resources. You put it all in the wrong places. You have a bunch of very, very talented people. They're all working as, POs in banks. But in fact, they're actually very talented people. Why are they working there? Those are the best jobs under central planning. You open up the economy, you suddenly see that there is a bunch of opportunities to be taken. And I think that's a very important part of what happened, was that there was massive gains from reallocation, talent moved, contract labor came in, bunch of stuff happened and the last thing I want to say, which is less emphasized, is that the breakdown of the joint family was key to the real estate boom. And the real estate boom is key to the transmission of growth to rural areas. One thing that people are puzzled by is UP and Bihar are not growing, or we're not growing for a long time. Why is poverty falling there? Well, one reason is that they are the major exporters of labor to the rest of the country. And in the rest of the country, the real estate boom was where they were working. The real estate boom plus the brick kilns, this is a huge part of how the urban prosperity gets transmitted to rural areas. I want to emphasize that because I think that's key to something that we should start worrying about, because that channel, I will claim, is broken right now. I think that in addition, and so that these are what I would call the structural drivers, the good things, which were to some extent are still there. Some of them less so, obviously, misallocation less so, but still I think there. What was also true is that I think there was these are things that helped for a while and can help in the short run. A poorly run financial sector is sort of a good gamble for if you're an enterprising businessman with good contacts and an ability to parlay your way into a big loan. It's not a bad thing. I mean, you have see the current story of the Ruyas having defaulted on any amount of loan on SR, now claiming that they should have the right to buy it back after they've borrowed on SR, defaulted on very, very large amounts of money. Their claim is we should have the right to buy it back because we were running better than anybody else. So, there's a certain amount of, if you are shameless enough and, just immense chutzpah. So if you're shameless enough and brave enough, you can make money. And the banking sector, when it's incompetent, it actually gives you a one-way gamble. You can always default. You have any number of layers in the corporate hierarchy of firms. Firms are held through many holding companies, so you can never lose your assets. You lose what you pledge, but that's very small, and you walk away from it. That's what the Ruyas are doing right now. So it's a very clear one-way gamble, and people took a lot of these one-way gambles. A lot of money was therefore invested, especially in things like real estate. Now, for the macroeconomy, these one-way gambles are not one-way gambles. They're two-way gambles because, of course, somebody's money, that person is losing it. It's often the bank's money. The bank's money is actually the depositor's money. The depositor's money, the government basically is implicitly guaranteeing. So that is not a one-way gamble. The economy is now facing the fact that it gave a lot of one-way gambles to people, but they came back to them. Then there is, in addition, this was made worse by the fact that there was a lot of opportunities created in mining, in real estate, in some other sort of more land-based businesses where there was just windfalls available. There was just lots of windfalls available. If you knew the right people, you could get large windfalls. And then I think the government, basically, this is also important, the government ran, especially if you think of UPA2, UPA2 ran entirely, its fisc ran on inflation. The government was borrowing very large amounts every year, and the debt to GDP ratio was falling every year. It was like completely, and the only way that happens is your real interest rates are very, very low. Why is it they're very, very low? Because the inflation is very high. So that was how the economy ran, and the reason why that worked was that the financial sector is closed, and so you can't export your savings, so your savings are trapped, and the government basically borrowed them at very low interest rates. This was the architecture of how UPA economy and NDA1, all of them ran more or less on the same architecture. So now this architecture started to unravel, and the facts are that here's a fact that I want to talk about growth, but I want to tell you something that is striking. We just have the analysis of the last available round of the NSS. The NSS is the National Sample Survey. 2017-18 NSS is people on average are poorer than they were in 2014-15. Not growth has slowed. They are poorer. Okay, this is a fact that, if you take away a fact from what I have to say, this is a fact to take away. They are now strictly poorer. Maybe these are within measures of, there's some error. I mean, these are very large samples, so, 200,000 people, so you shouldn't take much, don't take too much faith in the errors. There's some non-sampling errors, so maybe there's something slightly wrong, but these numbers this is something that hasn't happened for many years. Over a 4-year period, average consumption going down hasn't happened for many years. And this is after correcting for inflation. Okay, so this is for many years, meaning I'm guessing in the 70s. So this is a fact that should be extremely serious seen as extremely serious. Investment has totally collapsed. Private investment has collapsed by a factor of, I think, by 75% from its peak. Exports are not growing, have not been growing for a long time. Public borrowing, as Raghu, I think, points out, properly added up is 9–10% of GDP. I think this is a crisis. I think we can not call it a crisis if we want. We can say that we could be in a crisis, but I think we are in a crisis. I think.
You skipped a slide.
Oops, and I should not have, because why did this happen? So I don't have a full diagnosis, lots of things, but I'll say a couple of things. One is, I think that something interesting was happening in the last years of UPA2. What happened was that there was rising anger against crony capitalism, appropriately. The way they reacted to it was also appropriate, in the sense that they tried to create a set of institutions. For example, the National Green Tribunal and the Land Acquisition Act, plus putting more and more kind of sort of heft behind the Right to Information Act. These are all things that were very important to do at that time, because the idea was that for the long run, it's important that the state has credibility. And to have credibility, it's important that land acquisition becomes more transparent, that the environmental depredations that were happening get checked, etc. So those were all, I think, useful things to do. However, they happened late in UPA2. That's not and first thing that such institutions do is that they see their writ as saying there's so many problems, let's do something. So they started doing something. The first thing that does is it paralyzes. Why does it paralyze? Because, at that point, the institutions need judgment. They need to learn what to do and what not to do. They did a bunch of stuff. This is how all institutions evolve. But in this very early in their life, they led to a bunch of decisions that could not easily be moved, and that led to a situation where there was a sense of paralysis. I do think that this is something that was actually necessary. It didn't help the UPA. I think it would have helped in the long run. But I think the reaction of the new government was that this is a sign that we have given away too much power. So what they started to do was to re-centralize all decisions. You've given away too much power, let's now take it back. How do we take it back? The institutions exist. So instead we put people at the top who don't have any real decision authority. We punish people who stick out their neck, and we put the PMO, the Prime Minister's office, in every decision. That's how you do it. You don't actually destroy the institution. You kind of just take away their writ, but that means we're worse than not having the institution. Why? Because now there is a layer at which you can go. You have to go. You have to get approval, but you can't get that approval because these people are now, nobody wants to stick out their neck. They say, okay, wait, we'll check with PMO. PMO is busy, so nothing happens. So we went from having a situation with no institutions to having potentially better institutions which have their own challenges, to a situation where the institutions are now an extra level of bureaucratic check on the system, and the system. So this, I think, things basically institutions went from hyperactive to zombies. And zombies are the worst because now you're completely frozen in a sense. They're not even doing anything particularly. And I think this is part of the reason why investment has plunged. I talk to my friends who are businessmen. They say that it's impossible to invest. You don't know who's going to call you up and say that that's not the right thing to do. Okay. I think in addition, there is a demand problem. And I think this is a combination of demonetization, which had a huge effect on demand and had multiplier, GST implementation. I also think the monetary policy regime that basically tries to pin down inflation pretty low. This creates two things. One, it removes that UPA spigot, which was funding the economy. You don't have the spigot anymore. That was so there is some crowd out as a result. Basically, real interest rates go up as a result of that. And the second thing, so the government can't be financed through inflation. And second, it means that the government basically sat down and decided that agricultural prices can't keep going up, because otherwise inflation would go up. So what they did was the agricultural support prices, which is what essentially decides how much rice and wheat will be priced in the market, got flattened. And you can see the terms of trade moving sharply against agriculture in this period. That's a result of a policy choice. It's not an accident. It's a policy choice that the government made. And that, again, creates a demand deficit, adds to a demand deficit among the low-income population. So these are, and the financial crisis, which I think is both, I think the real estate sector overexpanded, and so there was a crisis coming. That crisis fed into the banking sector and the non-banking financial sector. The non-banking financial sector then started collapsing and stopped lending, which fed the real estate sector's credit then dropped. The ILFS crisis is playing both sides of that. The ILFS was both one of the beneficiaries of the lending, and when it also overbuilt, and when it started collapsing, the banks started collapsing. So it's a two-way relationship, and this is I think an important mechanism. Now that the real estate sector is frozen, you can see why rural consumption is going to not grow, because that's a major channel. And I think this is something to be worried about, even for a government that is not particularly sensitive, doesn't see it's particularly sensitive to this. I think they should worry about it. Okay, last couple of slides. I think the reaction to sharp growth slowdowns in the world has often been disastrous. This is what happened in the US in the mid-70s, in Latin America in the early 80s, in Japan in the early 90s. Each case, they failed to manage it. What they did was the reason is expectations are high. You expect growth should continue. And that makes it very hard to sell the message that we should just, tighten our belt on all sides. You don't do that. As a result, what you do is you flail around, you cut taxes on the rich, you make some public investment. Japan had all these wonderful bridges to nowhere, literally. So you make some public investments that don't make any sense. In the end, this is one of the things that we have a new book coming out. One we describe this in some detail, that all it does is really hurt the income distribution and make the government debt explode, often ending up in a full-blown meltdown. This is what happened in Latin America. And so I think we seem to be, you check off those things, you'll see we've just cut the taxes, we're considering some public investments, we're doing well on this time-honored path to disaster. What's the alternative? Well, I think become more proactive. I think in the short run, I think it's very important to do something about demand, because I think demand is a big problem. And to do that, I can say lots of the details. I'm also out of time. The main thing is that I think we should, in the short run, forget about monetary policy. And maybe this is where Raghu will disagree with me. I think the monetary policy, quantitative easing is what the US called it, because they didn't want to call it printing money. But I think having a more lax monetary policy is going to be important for this moment. And not interest rate cuts. We're trying interest rate cuts. No evidence that in a crisis, interest rate cuts do anything. They do something when the economy is doing okay, and when it's stopped growing, which may very well, it doesn't really do anything. Let the rupee slide, and since it's an NDA government, we can pray. I think if the short run moves us, if the short run moves by us some breathing room, let's be grateful and act fast. And I think the very important thing to do, and this is where I totally agree with Raghu, is to strengthen the institutions. And to do that, I think one of the things we have to do is just not, I think it's very important to not act on people who look like they were contradicting the government's rate. I think the Caesar's wife principle applies extremely strongly here. The government cannot be seen, even if it's true that this guy was doing something bad. It's very important that you demonstrate that they were actually doing something bad before you act, and rather than act before you demonstrate. And then you put the people in jail and then check, see if you can find something. That's the wrong way to go. And I think that undermines confidence in the government. And likewise, give media the chance to pursue transparency. I think this is in the government's interest. I think the government needs to do this too, if it wants to build the credibility of its institutions and accepting criticism as well. And I think the second thing that needs to be done in the very short run, immediately, and I don't want to talk about the longer run because I don't have any time and I don't have much to say either, is that there should be, I think one thing we don't have is a landing plan for the economy. How do you go from 9–10% public debt and an economy that's frozen to some place where the economy lands without making up numbers for about the growth rate? The growth will be 8% from next year onwards, etc. Let's not make up those numbers. Let's give a landing path that's realistic and then stick to that plan without having to be creative. I'll stop there. Last point.
You want to come forward? Come up here. So, did you want to have some response, and then maybe open up the floor?
Just a couple of points. First, thank you for that really, truly excellent analysis. And I mean, Abhijit and I often agree on 90% of things, and so I'd say absolutely. Just a couple of additions to what you said. On the real estate, I thought that was a really important point. But I think it's twofold. One is as I understand it, and maybe you already implied this, real estate construction employed people from UP and Bihar, but also real estate sales from the rural areas to the expanding cities were very important in generating incomes, and where a lot of people have experience of people buying SUVs and so on in rural areas based on land sales, and that was also important to consumption. That too has dried up in part because we're not expanding some of these infrastructure investments. On agri prices, I do think we've made a change, and certainly the NDA, the Modi one has been very good or very bad, as the case may be, at keeping support prices from increasing tremendously. The problem with support prices is they're not available to many people. So I think in the longer run, we do have to move away from support prices to some kind of insurance scheme which is available. Now, I think Abhijit was very right in pointing to the fact we've moved from negative real interest rates to positive real interest rates by bringing down inflation. And in fact, I had a lot of grief when we did that, because a lot of pensioners used to say, I used to earn 9% on my FDs, and now I'm earning only 5%. This is terrible. And I used to have to explain to them they were earning 9% when inflation was 11. And therefore, the real interest rate was -2, while in fact, they were earning 5 when it was inflation was now 3. And so the real interest rate was 2. So, but in fact, what this means is it changes the nature of the equation. You no longer get money at negative interest rates. You have to adjust for that. And that's the broader point about Abhijit's analysis. I think he's absolutely right that some of this was removing some of the constraints which were holding back growth earlier. And just removing the constraints created substantial growth. I would say there were some actual reforms, including bringing down the tariffs, etc. But that created the spectacular growth with some delay from when the NDA one did it to when the UPA one actually experienced it. And I think that delay partly created some of the lack of political support for further reforms, because it was, we do reforms, we don't get the growth, somebody else gets the growth. Why do that? India shining did not pay off as a political strategy. That was generally feeling, while on the other hand, the farm loan waiver in 2009 was thought to have helped the UPA's case. But all this, I think, means that as we have closed the old ways of growth, it's extremely important that we open new ways of growth. And these new ways have to be more consistent with these better structured economy, where you take risks. If those risks don't work out, you pay the price. If they do work out, you make money. We need to move to that kind of economy rather than an economy based on rents. And that requires reform. And I think this is the point that Abhijit is making, which I think is extremely important, that that old method no longer works. We've run its course. And therefore, if we need growth again, let's not believe it's just about stimulus. It's not going to help, in part because the system is stressed. Interest rate cuts don't work anymore because the system doesn't pass them through. Doesn't pass them through because it's significantly stressed. One, we need to de-stress the system, and there are lots of ideas there. But two, we need to engage in that new generation of reforms. If we don't do that, we're not going to grow.
All right, so we'd be happy to take some questions from the. Yes.
So given that there's the government can't borrow so much and there's a fiscal tightening that the government has, and there's obviously money that the government needs, and you also called for reduced public sector presence from the government side, why is there such a strong opposition to disinvestment in PSUs? I know you specifically tweeted about not disinvesting in BPCL.
Who did? I don't tweet. I've never tweeted. That's a fake tweet.
Fake news.
That account is not a genuine account.
Yeah. No. So there are.
The Raghuram Rajan account is not a genuine Twitter account.
I have fake accounts on Twitter which sort of mimic me or whatever. No, but the point is a good one, that one source of resources will be public sector disinvestment. But I mean, again, this reflects the inability of the government bureaucrats to let go. And disinvestment is, I'm going to sell one oil company to another oil company, and that's disinvestment. Well, no, it's not disinvestment. It means the government gets money, but it's still owned by the government. What we need is genuine disinvestment. Of course, you need to improve the governance of these firms. You can't disinvest without having improved governance, but it's chicken and egg. Both have to be done simultaneously, and perhaps monitor the process a little bit after letting go, maybe hold 30% and make sure the governance is actually stable before you let go completely. And you may get a greater price. So go below 51, still have some ability to control, ensure the governance is reasonable, sell down further. And there are many areas where India is in businesses that the government need not be in. You can get some experience. Privatize one bank. There was some move to privatize IDBI. They backed off. We need to be bold on some of these measures. That will create some resource. But I also agree with Abhijit. If you can credibly signal, we are in stress, we are going to spend more today in ways that enhance demand, but here is our path to restore fiscal sanity in the short to medium run. And these are the institutions which mean that we won't do the old game of pushing stuff into the next budget and borrowing off balance sheet and all this stuff. We'll come clean with real budget numbers. And we'll tell you how the real budget numbers will move down. I think that would be received very well by the market because it suggests that you, in fact, are going to do the right thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask a little more about you seem to put more emphasis on decentralization than deregulation. And we sort of remember that Modi started his economic reputation when he found land for the Tata Motors nano factory that the communists in Calcutta couldn't find. And I have this vision of India with all these little Modis and all the states and departments making swift decisions, and I just wonder if that's going to do it, or how do you see the balance between decentralization and deregulation, and I guess is pruning enough, or do we need Margaret Thatcher to come to town?
India is not ready for Margaret Thatcher.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
So, if we decentralize more, there's a real chance that the power at the lower levels will be in the hands of people who want to regulate. Yeah?
Yeah.
So even if we, it seems to me that would be one way. Yeah.
I think decentralization in this environment means competition between states, where they have the power to affect more. And that competition will almost naturally reduce the incentive to over-regulate. the right regulation, we need the right level of regulation. Now, I'm not necessarily emphasizing decentralization more than deregulation. I think we need both in some areas, and we need, in some areas, better regulation and stronger enforcement agencies which can enforce appropriately. Certainly, as I said, in zoning, for example, or in emissions, we need agencies that actually enforce. I mean, look at the Ganges, for example, the extent of pollution. We need agencies that can enforce the amount of pollution that's going into the Ganges. So these are the kinds of things where we may need more regulation, but we need it to be transparent and not a means of using the regulation as a means to extort. And all too often, unfortunately, in India, sometimes that happens.
So thank you for both talks. This has been fantastic. And I noticed that on all the economic stuff, there was a slightly pessimistic register, maybe even a crisis, and the data is worse than we look. And then both of you ended your comments by saying, well, you know, what we need is more democracy and better institutions. And you know, I couldn't agree more. The question is, do you actually believe this government is good for either institutions or democracy? And I ask this because it is a classic populist government, right? And populist leaders, you know, and we know many of them now. There's not only Modi, but we have Bolsonaro and we have Trump. And insofar as they think they embody the people, they really don't care about institutions. And they really don't care a whole lot about civil society either. And so the question, I guess, is under this kind of a highly populist regime that in some ways is I find even more likely to slide towards authoritarianism than, say, a Bolsonaro, because it's actually supported by an incredibly programmatic, ideologically coherent movement and 6 million cadres. What allows us to believe that with the kind of majority powers they have now, they're actually interested in strengthening the institutions as opposed to just patrimonializing the institutions, and that they're actually interested in protecting liberalism and the day-to-day processes and norms that sustain democracy between elections?
Well, so I had two parts to my wish list, and I was not that optimistic about the first part, which was the decentralization, liberalization, strengthening institutions. On the other hand, I think the second part will become necessary. I think Abhijit also, that the old method of growth has ended. And in order to regenerate growth once again, we really need these reforms. And it's not just a cyclical downturn, it's also a structural downturn. And that may be the way that power gets distributed more as we try these reforms, as we hit a roadblock. That's the sense in which both the sort of monolithic power that is building up will come under stress, but also it will have to share power more widely in an attempt to revive growth. Put in some of those checks and balances. So economic institutions may benefit. Political institutions, we have to wait and see.
Has spoken about how the real estate boom in the urban areas was actually causing a connection that made sure that people in rural areas were also getting positively impacted. So knowing that those sort of connections do exist between urban India and rural India, at this juncture in time, what does the government focus on? Do they say, let's try reviving growth in the urban areas to make sure that connection will go down to the rural areas, or do they focus on the rural areas themselves?
I mean, I do think that there isn't. I endorse what Raghu said on the last question, which is that I think that if anything, I think the core driver right now will be certain compulsions which are more or less inevitable, and I don't think they will be easily avoided. I think they are, and I don't think the government has a huge numbers of levers here. I think one of the levers that it has, I think it will need to do something about demand, and it will have to do something about the banking sector. And if it does something about the banking sector, real estate will revive to a certain extent automatically. So I don't think that these are choices that the government is sitting on. Many choices, it could do this, that, and the other. I think mostly the choices are fairly limited. The fiscal mess makes it much harder to do very much. So the space is limited. So it's going to be if it has to be successful, it should do a few very targeted things, and one of them has to be use some of that, whatever way you generate those extra resources to fix the non-banking financial sector at some of the banks that were lending to those, etc. I think that's going to then revive the real estate sector. I think part of the problem in the real estate sector is that the finance has completely dried up.
I mean, just to add to that, basically, I think it has to work on many fronts at the same time, because we haven't worked on them for so long. And so it has to move into really emergency mode at this point. And the amount of, the number that Abhijit put up on consumption is, should be something which is a real wake-up call.
As a political scientist, I really enjoyed both your lectures and your comments. So there's a kind of classic, much criticized theory about the relationship between democracy and economic growth. That's usually attributed to Adam Przeworski, the idea that you need to hit a certain level of economic development for democratic institutions to be established, and then to maintain that level of growth for them to be sustained. And I was just wondering, kind of putting both your comments together, because I think what you mentioned, Abhijit, which is really important, is that one of the factors that many people are saying lies at the root of the rise of exclusionary populist governments is the decline in economic growth. And so if to some extent, Modi and Bolsonaro and Trump, one strand of arguments would say is the result really of the financial crisis. There are dashed expectations, the kind of disturbing number that you put up of people actually becoming poorer. And so then if it is the case that there is this relationship between democracy and economic growth and the politics and the economics, is it that we're kind of caught in the opposite trap? And I'm just wondering, if the beginning is the fiscal crisis, then maybe we should, as political scientists, be looking at economists for the solutions. Because now it seems as if we're in this, we're moving towards declining economic growth. And that, because of the rise of these populist exclusionary regimes, is leading to a further erosion of democracy. And so we have this kind of, re-centralization, de-institutionalization. And in some ways, as you said, it's very reminiscent in India of Mrs. Gandhi, the kind of taking away, in many ways people would say the Kashmir issue begins with undermined elections during Indira Gandhi, the kind of dismissal of popularly elected governments using president's rule. And so to some extent, the difference there is that she was de-institutionalizing and taking away the power of the press and a number of these institutions, but she herself was sitting on a very de-institutionalized party, because more than anything else, she was de-institutionalizing the Congress. Now here the big difference is that Modi, on the other hand, is riding on a highly institutionalized RSS. What in a way kind of distinguishes the BJP government from previous Congress regimes is the kind of presence of the grassroots civil society RSS linkages. And Modi is not anything if he's not an RSS man. So the question then is that it's almost as if, like, this relationship that I knew as a PhD, as a graduate student, high economic growth, high democracy. Now, a decade and a half later, we're in the opposite one. So then, if we had to kind of go chicken and egg, what begins it, what needs to be solved? Maybe the problem is less the democratic institutions in terms of what needs to be fixed first, but really what needs to be fixed is we need to be pushed up that, up onto that upper right quadrant of the Przeworski and Lemonji curve to take us back to a level of economic growth that can then begin to kickstart the democratic process again, or at least stop its erosion.
Say one thing, which I don't believe any of those curves.
In 77.5% of the democracy years in the world since 1950 are predicted by income.
Look,
it's a very big conclusion of the biggest project of
this. This is a huge debate, I'm sure, that could be had. I believe that there are reasons why there's a relationship between markets and democracy. I mean, the thought experiment is think of one socialist country. I'm not talking about Sweden. I'm talking about truly socialist, which is fully democratic. My cousins used to say Enver Hoxha's Albania, and we know that wasn't democratic. But it's hard to think of such a, I mean, there may be a stray example or two, but I think this is one place where Abhijit and I probably have different views. But to your broader point, which is, look, I mean, there are lots of things that go into an election, right? I think, as Abhijit pointed out, corruption was a big factor in the 2014 election. And I think one place where this government has done fairly well is on perceptions of corruption. There have been allegations, no doubt, but the perceptions broadly is it's a relatively clean government, right? So in that sense, I think there could be other factors than just economic growth. I think the point that Arvind made last time, that the benefits that people have got have also been quite significant. And you know, in a world where your general income levels are relatively low, something like that could make a big difference. I remember I got to build a toilet. Or I remember I got cooking gas, at least the first cylinder, free.
There's a question there, and I'll get to you, Ashwa.
That lateral entry of people who have, academia or people from academic institutions into the government would help decentralization and making our democracy more stronger?
I don't know that it would help decentralization. I think it is necessary. I mean, one of having been an outside input into government, one of the things that struck me was, on the one hand, how much experience there was. On the other hand, how little knowledge there was. And you need that to be combined in the sense that, I mean, some of these people have never done finance. So, and they're asked to do an IPO. Well, where are they going to get the knowledge from? I think when you start debating at the international level, you're debating trade policy, you're debating monetary policy, you're debating with people who spent 20 years in that field after getting their PhDs. And what we send are generalists there who've spent, a year in the department because they've just been transferred. So we absolutely need experts, and I think successive governments have seen that. The problem is, does the system accept an outside expert? And the system usually says, yes, acceptable, provided you limit the term to 3 years, and at the end of that, you kick them out. Who's going to come in and spend 3 years of their life working for something and then, have no further prospects? They come in, but they come in at joint secretary level and have no scope for further promotion because the system wants to preserve its positions. Doesn't want these people to get those positions. So we need a lot of work here to make sure that we have this back and forth. We need to be able to hire private sector experts into the banking system, for example. We should be able to pay more market-related salaries and not have a CBI investigation every time you pay that. On what grounds did you pay that?
Sure. Do you think that the civil services, the exams which are conducted and bureaucrats which are trained in a particular manner, we need to revisit that thing over entirely? Now time has come. Sorry.
No, let me just quickly answer that. I mean, personally, I think you get good people there. I mean, you talk to these young civil servants, they're excellent. You just have to make sure they constantly refresh their knowledge. And they don't sort of basically depend on their experience rather than refreshing. Some do and are very, very good. Others sort of bask and don't do. So constant retraining. I think the government has gotten a lot better at that over time. There's a lot more programs. I mean, Ashu teaches some of these officers who come. But it needs to be much more. We were actually trying to create an IAS institute for these economic learning. We need to do things like that to keep it, up to speed. And lateral entry is absolutely important. That's your first question.
So this question we have discussed in part. Now that we've had these two remarkable lectures and great commentaries, let me think they think about political economy in a slightly different manner. What does the leadership, current leadership, highly electorally enhanced, want? One, I have to keep myself in power. Two, make India great again. Three, make India Hindu, if possible. I think if you think about the three biggest objectives that the current leadership would have, perhaps these are those three. Where does growth matter? In which objectives? I think this is how when we think about what are his objectives, what are their objectives, and where would growth come in? Now, why was I re-elected with such an enhanced majority? Now we have very good data on that. One thing we don't have good data on, but the three biggest things were, number one, 1/3 of the entire BJP's vote was for Mr. Modi's personality, incorruptibility, whatever you want to call it, right? We know that very well. It was 1/4 in 2014, it became 1/3. Number two, national security gave him a spike of 11%. Number three, cooking gas gave him a spike of 8%. Now, unfortunately, in our surveys, toilet question, we should have asked it in a more interesting way, or should not have dropped it halfway, etc. We should have been asked, I think. So let's say that also mattered. So my personality, national security, and I'll quickly get that. National security, and let's say two schemes, toilets and cooking gas. Which of these going forward will require growth is the question I'm going to ask. Otherwise, I don't care.
Yeah.
I just do not care.
So I would say that schemes are all about deltas rather than levels. What have you done for me lately? The current level is unaffordable at the Hindu rate of growth. And, according to Arvind Subramaniam, and certainly borne out by these, we are at that Hindu rate of growth or below. We've re-achieved it. It's unaffordable. So your schemes go. Make India great again. Militarily spending requires resources. You need a budget for it. You need expanded revenues. We have a northern neighbor who is now militarizing at a significant pace in the most frontier technologies. It's not a Western neighbor that is in a sense that if we want to make India great again, that is the biggest concern. It is big power rivalry. We are no match. We are 1/5 the size of China, and if we are really growing at the Hindu rate of growth, we are shrinking relative to China, not catching up. So I think, and finally, of course, you put the fact that you can't cut spending, but you have to enhance it in order to get that re-election, and that you need to spend more on defense if you want to make India great again. It certainly implies growth. And if we don't have growth, well, then you get the consequences.
All right, one more question?
Just a quick follow-up to this discussion. Would that kind of resources come from their scheme of, attacking the elite and transferring that money from the elite to the poorer people? For example, they're looking at inheritance tax, which would create significant revenues.
Yeah, I mean, there is a real question of how populist you want to get before you damage your base. I'm not just talking about a popular base, but the base where you get your financing and so on. Remember, one of the things that helps elections is significant amounts of money, and so you can certainly find all sorts of ways of taxing property and so on, but eventually it's going to be hard to pluck the goose. Well, there was
slaughter the.
was that?
I just want to add to that. I mean, if you look at, I think maybe you can see, I think, the wisdom of what Raghu said in the fact that it didn't take the government very long to cut back the corporate taxes. It wasn't it was not particularly draconian, and it went very, very fast. So I think inheritance tax, I'm in favor of inheritance taxes. I'll put it out there, but I don't think it's about to happen or about to stick.
All right. Well, I want to thank you all for coming, and I also want to thank the speakers for most enlightening conversations, and I think we all learned a lot.
Thank you.
And there's a reception outside.
And there's a reception outside, yes. Okay.